Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kirsty Foster, Associate Dean International at Sydney Medical School. Thank you all for joining us today for this session about CaRMS. And I'm delighted to introduce Sandra Banner, the Executive Director and CEO of CaRMS, who is with us tonight, and it's a delight to welcome her to welcome you to Sydney Medical School. Sandra's had a very hectic programme. I was exhausted listening to it around Australia, and we're very grateful to you to be here tonight and look forward to hearing what you're saying. For those of you who are on the webinar, you know you have an opportunity to type in questions and we'll relay them to Sandra when appropriate. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Sandra.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Now, let's see if I can get this right to start with. Okay, that is exactly what my farm looked like when I left them 2 weeks ago. So you guys have chosen a wonderful place to live, and you missed the winter of 2015, which has gone down and broken all the records. Aren't you clever? Anyway, I'm not leaving until it gets warm down there. I think it is getting warmer now. So I'm here today to provide bridges back to this university as well as the other universities in Australia to, I hope, help you to realize that you can contact CaRMS and ask your questions. It doesn't really matter what year you're in. And to be able to provide accurate, timely information, and also to help you to understand how to strategize, possibly, what things you need to be considering, where your challenges lay, and just to make sure you understand that we do know what you're facing in challenges, and certainly CaRMS itself is an organization that really only has one job, and that is to manage the transition between undergraduate and postgraduate medicine. That's our role in the system. We are very well positioned to do that, and we are completely available to you to provide you information. So quickly about CaRMS itself, it actually has been around for a very long time. It started, the first match was in 1969, but the medical students were running it and they didn't get cooperation from the faculties, so it became an organization in order to make sure that the schools and hospitals all got on board. So it's been running since then. It's quite a mature organization. It's built on trust within the faculties, and it's built on a contract, which I know that you will know about and we'll talk about. The important thing for you is that we are centrally situated in the medical education community. In fact, as the CEO, I sit on the boards and on committees of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, of the College of Family Physicians of Canada, of the Medical Council of Canada, of the Federation of Medical Licensing Authorities of Canada, and of the AFMC, the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada. What that means to you is that I bring you up-to-date and accurate information, and it's a credible source for you to find the answers. And I have to tell you that I have spent a lot of time working with Canadians studying abroad, and I think one of the problems that they face is they're very vulnerable to rumors and to perhaps visiting faculty or going home and talking to people, and you're not always getting the straight or accurate answers. And the only people who are hurt by that are you. So if you take anything from my talk today, it's that you really always have to go back and check at the source. If you want to know about licensure in any province, the only people who can give you an accurate answer are the licensing authorities. That doesn't mean other people won't give you answers, because I think that's one thing about the profession, is they're always happy to answer your questions. It's just they may not have the latest and accurate information. So the CaRMS website has all of the links to all of the organizations that are of concern to you on the website. So please, how many of you have been on the website already? Good for you. Good, good. The other, probably most critical website that you should be visiting and know very well is the Medical Council of Canada. How many of you have been on that website? Your relationship with the Medical Council of Canada, should you ever come to either do postgraduate training or practice in Canada, is a lifetime relationship. So that is you know, CaRMS, you'll come and go in your life, but the medical council is there until the end of your practice. So how many of those of you here tonight, at this point in time, would like to go home to do your postgraduate training? A lot of you. Okay. I presume I could add that last question, which is how many of you intend to practice in Canada?
For the benefit of the people who are watching remotely, could you tell how many people?
Not sure, but it looked pretty universal. It looked like almost all of you. That's a fairly major consideration. And obviously the rest of you, how many of you would consider practicing in Canada even if you didn't necessarily do your postgraduate training in Canada? Okay, that's almost all of you. Okay, so most of what I bring to you today then will be of relevance. What I want to talk to you about is the different pathways home. There isn't just one pathway. When I talk about CaRMS, it's often as important to tell you what we're not, because it'll help to put us in a context. So we have nothing to do with the provincial funding models that are out there. We have nothing to do with program requirements for entry into postgraduate medicine. However, our role is to collect those requirements and to provide them on our website, but we don't have anything to do with the setting of requirements. We are not decision makers. Nothing that you're going to do in the next few years have anything to do with CaRMS, except we are the process. That's all we are, is just the process. We don't have anything to do with interviews, although even in Canada, everybody talks about the CaRMS interview. I can assure you, they're not coming to me for a job, so it isn't actually a CaRMS interview, but it does become the label. Quota is outside of our purview. We have no role in how quota is set. Again, our website will give you quotas, but we have nothing to do with it. And of course, we have no role in ranking. As I indicated, our job is one, and that is to design and manage the process of application and ranking into our postgraduate system, both at the entry level and again at the subspecialty level. And that's what we're busy doing. Sometimes what the match actually is isn't clearly understood, and that's, I mean, same as in Canada. When we visit our Canadian schools, we have questions about what is actually happening in the match, and I think it's really important that you have an understanding of that. So the match, the algorithm itself is the same algorithm they use in the US. So they have their version, it's not a version of it, but they run it themselves, and we run ours, but it's exactly the same algorithm. And it's actually designed by Canadian, and it won a Nobel Prize for application of a games theory mathematical algorithm. It's sometimes called a stable marriage algorithm. And now what would that be? It'd be hard to know what a stable marriage is. Anyway, what they're implying is that both parties agree to the results. Okay, so the stable marriage. It allows programs to decide who they want to train and applicants to decide where they want to go. Our role in this is that you can apply to wherever you're eligible to apply. You can apply to as many programs, as many pathways as you want. It has nothing to do with us. And it is always kept confidential, actually. So no program that you apply to ever knows that you had any other program that you're interested in, or any other discipline, or any other options. They only know that in front of them is an application from you. So your entire strategy and your ranking is entirely confidential. The match is based on the rank order list. So you can apply to the match and apply all across Canada, but if you don't submit a rank order list, you can't possibly be matched. Doesn't matter where you've applied, unless I actually get a rank order list from you, then you're not in the match. You're in the application side, but you're not in the actual match. So it's called an applicant proposing algorithm. And the reason it's called that is because it used to be program proposing. The US adopted this particular Canadian product before we did. They adopted it back, I think, in the very early 80s, and we didn't take it on until 1986. But at some point in the US, they're so much more litigious than the Canadians are, somebody didn't get what they wanted and decided to challenge in court the algorithm itself and said that it was disadvantageous to the student, to the applicant, and it was only advantageous to the program. So the Canadian company that I don't know if they actually initially created the algorithm, but those that have administered it and use it in this process decided to develop an applicant proposing algorithm rather than using the program proposing algorithm, and then they ran previous matches against it. And in the US, they compared the results, and it was like 0.0001 who changed after running an applicant proposing algorithm rather than a program proposing algorithm. So it doesn't make very much difference. However, a few years later in Canada, I ran it as well against previous matches, and it actually had more impact in Canada than it did in the US. But that's because we're so small that we often have a program of one quota, and we might have two people vying for it, and they might also have another program that they're also applying to and vying for. And only in that circumstance does a program proposing algorithm change the results as opposed to an applicant. So the idea is that the match results will give you the best possible results that is available to you from the list you provide. So when you key on and get your match results and you find out your match to your 6th choice out of a list of 20 choices, what it means is your first 5 did not have an offer for you before they filled with people they preferred. So it's your best choice. It's the top choice. And so on July 1st, when you turn up at that institution, you will clearly tell them that it was your first choice. How would they know? It is now your first choice, because you didn't have any others. And Canadians do that all the time. So it's your first choice. You can only then, in the end, get your first choice. So probably one of the topics we need to get off the table tonight is, who are you? How do you fit back into the system? You've made a choice, a very brave choice, and for those of you who chose to come to Australia, which all of you did, you also made a very wise choice. If you're going to go abroad for your medical education, you couldn't have chosen a country that was more aligned in terms of physician education and training than Australia. And certainly our results show that of all the countries where Canadians are currently studying, and this year there's at least 60 different countries around the world where we found Canadians, Australia had by far and always has had the highest proportion who are successful through the match. All that said, in our system, you are known as an international medical graduate because you have trained in an international medical school outside of the North American system, which has one accreditation system. So all of the schools in North America are accredited by the CACMS/LCME, and please don't ask me to say what that acronym means, accreditation system. So although you're attending schools that are accredited in a very robust way, you're not attending a school that's accredited by that committee. Hence, you are an international medical graduate. That is not a term that has anything to do with citizenship or where you were born. It does, however, we do recognize that you are a subset of that cohort in the Canadian system. And my definition of you as a subset is that it's totally about timing. That you are legal in Canada, legal to work, legal with all the privileges of Canadian citizenship, before you got an MD degree. Whereas the other subset of international medical graduates, who are immigrants, are legal in Canada, with all the privileges, but they became legal after they got a medical degree. So it's entirely and only the timing of your legality and the degree that separates you from the other subset of international medical graduates. And as you probably know, because I'm sure you're not here out of without having done some research, you probably understand that there's always been lots of dialogue in Canada around the cohort of international medical graduates who are Canadians studying abroad. But by every definition, you fit that category. And so in our system, education-wise, you apply and go through the system as an international medical graduate. This year, we have more than 1,000 in the match who are, in fact, Canadians who've studied abroad. So, as a group, you have been growing in number. And those numbers are beginning to have a fairly significant impact in the Canadian medical education arena. Probably you've heard some of the tensions that are back in Canada around you as a group. They're coming from many different places. One is our own domestic students. They're a bit anxious about you because there are so many of you and you do quite well in the match. And over the last few years, there have been more of the domestic graduates who are unmatched after 2 iterations of the match than ever before. And so they're kind of looking at you thinking, well, maybe that's the reason we have so many unmatched students. I don't know what the reason is. Right now I'm doing a research project on that. We're looking at all the qualitative documents as well as the quantitative issues to see why we have so many unmatched Canadian students right now. But there are tensions because I sometimes actually call you an invasive species. You've kind of arrived and starting to eat up a lot of things around you. And certainly the resources that initially were imagined to be resources for our immigrant physicians, but because you fit into that group, and you do very well in competition with the immigrant physicians. So you've kind of taken over a little bit some of that, those resources. Okay, so I'm not going to spend very much time talking about the match process for lots of reasons. First of all, it's very simple. Second of all, we're so organized that once you join the match, once you register with the match, we will harass you with details. In fact, you can only fail if you want to. You can only miss deadlines because you choose to, because we are constantly sending you updates. It's out there everywhere. So I don't think that is a good use of our time tonight to get into those kinds of details. Also, many of you are a few years from graduation and you won't hold it anyway. It's an application, it's online. You can make your portfolio quite personal. You can apply to as many programs as you want to in as many streams as you want to, provided you're eligible. And you can personalize your application to every single program as you wish. I think that probably the #1 topic that I get questions about is in fact not the application process, none of that, but rather electives back in the Canadian system. Yes? Did you come here to hear about electives? Yeah. Anyway, so I'd like to answer some of your questions around electives. I can tell you that we have a new portal that has been set up by the Association of Faculties of Medicine. Right now, I think they have about 11 of the 17 medical schools participating in that portal. I believe that that will change some of the, what would be the right word here? Opportunities even, because we're now going to have something that counts and tracks and all of that. But the pressure that you feel in trying to get an elective back in Canada is the same pressure that Canadian students feel in trying to get an elective who are graduating from Canada. Because the elective system is not very well organized. Probably because I'm not doing it. Because the postgraduate system is incredibly well organized. But there isn't any transparency, but that lack of organization works very well for you. Because you're able to possibly be creative about arranging electives. The schools themselves are feeling unbelievable pressure from, one, their own students, because We've had a rapid expansion, as most of you know. We've increased our undergraduate by 80% in the last decade. But somehow, with all of the work that went into that, nobody really looked at maintaining an elective process that also was increased, identified faculty, use people. Nobody did that. So our students are so unhappy about how they get electives in Canada. All of the faculties are under unbelievable pressure because they aren't doing it very well. And then you add to that the Canadians who are abroad. And you can see a recipe for a very unhappy system. Are electives really important? I would lie to you if I didn't say that it's a great thing to be able to get an elective in Canada, because it is. We know that. If you have an opportunity to do an elective in Canada, you benefit from it. You get a much better understanding about what the expectations are going to be on the clinical wards compared to what the expectations are in the system that you're training in. You just get a feel for it, you make some networks, maybe you get a really good reference letter. But the point is, it's very difficult to get these electives. You probably will not necessarily get them through the schools themselves. You may have to tap whatever networks you can in order to find creative ways to arrange electives. And because of that, getting an elective in your discipline of choice or your school or even your province becomes a very difficult process. What I see is that it hasn't had a great deal of impact. People, yes, if you can get an elective, for sure that's going to help. But I match every year Canadians studying abroad who did not do any electives in Canada. So if you can't make that arrangement, you don't say, okay, it's over, I'm not going to be able to get back to Canada because I couldn't arrange an elective. That's not necessarily the case. But that's not to say stop trying, because obviously if you have a letter of reference from someone from the Canadian system, it's easier for our programs to put some weight on that letter. They just understand it better than they might understand the Australian system. So by all means, keep working at that elective arrangement, but don't feel like your life is over if it doesn't happen for you. This new portal will start counting things like weeks and where you're doing your electives if you're doing it through that organization. And that will eventually, I think, have an impact on how accessible the system is for Canadians studying abroad. Right now we have a bit of a general rule that you can't do more than 12 weeks in Canada. Well, no one can track them, so there isn't any way that they can prevent you from doing more than 12 weeks. Probably can't do more than 12 weeks at any individual school because they could track that. So there's still a lot of gray area in the electives process, which serves you quite well. Makes it a little easier for you to slip in and get something done. But it is a pressure that everyone is feeling. You're not unique in that. Not going to go through this. MSPRs are a document that is only a North American document, as you might know. It's not actually an Australian document, but the school here has been preparing that for a long time, and they do a very good job. We're not as excited in Canada about a standard MSPR. I think in the US it's called MSPE, as they are in the US. It's the Dean's letter, in effect. In the US it has to be very rigidly adhere to a standard, but in the true Canadian way, we all agree to a standard and then everybody does their own thing. So it's not as critical that your letter looks exactly like the US model, so you needn't worry about that. Anybody have any burning questions they want to ask about what we've just covered? No? Okay.
Cyberspace is silent as well.
Pardon?
Cyberspace is silent as well.
Oh, good. All right. So what I have here is I looked at the website and I was trying to take a moment out for you to remind you how incredibly complex that system is, and to alert you that you have to be really careful when you're on the website searching things out so you know what is ahead, because every province approaches it differently. So as of about 2006, the ministries of health in most provinces decided to specifically fund training for international medical graduates. Before that, they really didn't do that. Ontario, yes, a bit, but that was really the beginning of that process. And almost all the provinces decided, once the ministries decided to commit funding, that it would be a separate pool of funding. And so you see that as a parallel stream. So once that sort of got into place and the governments realized that they kind of had a captive audience there, and they got really excited about what we now call the return of service. And for almost all of the parallel streams, there is a return of service component. So this graph, I just want to go through with you some of the complexities around that. You may know it, but I'm going to go through it with you anyway. So I've labeled it by province because there's multiple schools in some of those areas, and they all follow a provincial guideline. So the schools don't set these. The provinces do because they're the funders. So in Newfoundland, whether you're training in New Brunswick or PEI or on the Rock, the first iteration has a parallel stream, and that is whatever disciplines they all agree to. It's a parallel stream, and only international medical graduates can apply to that stream. Conversely, of course, you can't apply to the Canadian positions in Newfoundland. If there are any vacancies at all after the first iteration is run, whether it's in the Canadian stream or the IMG stream, they get put into the second iteration, and then it's competitive. So anybody can apply to the vacancies if you meet the criteria in the second iteration. The return of service in Newfoundland is only attached to the first iteration, to the parallel stream. So if you're matched in the parallel stream, you owe back to the province after you've graduated, after you're certified, whatever number of years is attached to your training. So if it's family medicine, it's probably 2 years. And if it's a Royal College specialty, it's more. And I don't have it right in front of me, but it's more than 2 years. However, if you're matched in the second iteration, there's no return of service. It disappears with the competitive nature of the second iteration. Nova Scotia, which again is New Brunswick and PEI, follow exactly the same pattern. Okay, so in either area, you will be following that, and if you're matched in the first iteration, you have a return of service. If you're matched in the second, you don't. Quebec doesn't have any return of service. They did not apply that at all. However, in Quebec, you have to be pre-assessed. You can't enter the match with your appropriate examinations. They won't consider you. You have to write and get all that documentation done through the Quebec government before you're ever allowed to apply in Quebec. So it actually takes a little bit longer than anywhere else. So for one thing, they want you to write the QE1, which you can do. Your timing is okay to write the QE1. But for another, you need to be proficient in French. So that may exclude most of you. But if you are in, it's competitive and there's no return of service. In Ontario, again, they have a parallel match, and in the second iteration, it's competitive. However, the return of services applies to both matches, and it's not 2 years and then multiple years, it's 5 years no matter how you're matched in Ontario. You still owe back the province a 5-year commitment at practice. Manitoba, well, both Manitoba and Saskatchewan, there are some people here from the Prairie Provinces, right? They're quite interested in bringing their graduates home. Yeah. So it's a good idea to get in touch with Manitoba, and I'm not sure which. The Ministry of Health will certainly help, and the faculty early on, because both those two provinces are quite committed to people who have roots in the province getting into their postgraduate system. And so, and they have quite a lot of people who leave the province. Don't know why, but they do. So they have recruitment issues. We all know that. And Saskatchewan particularly has the highest proportion of international medical graduates practicing of anywhere in Canada. So they're very interested in the cohort who are abroad, who have real links to the province. So it can be a bit of an advantage. I'm not saying it's going to get you a position, but I'm saying it is a bit of an advantage, and to be sure that you follow up with that. They have the same process as some of the rest of the provinces. It's competitive in the second iteration, and there's no return of service in the second iteration. Now, Manitoba used to have competitive all the way along because they actually lost a human rights challenge a number of years ago. And some of you may know that. And so everything was competitive, but a new dean has come in and memories have faded, and so they've gone to the same system as the rest of Canada, and nobody's challenged it, so that's where we're back to that. Saskatchewan, which, as I said, is the province with the highest number of international medical graduates practicing, has the most difficult access for international medical graduates at the postgraduate level. I mean, I think for a few years they only put one position in, and they actually ask for your firstborn child. They've relaxed a little, and they still only put 1 or 2 positions in, but if there's any vacancies in the stream of family medicine that's Canadian, they'll just put all those positions into the IMG stream. So it turns out that after we run the first iteration in Saskatchewan, there's always a lot of IMGs matched to usually family medicine, because they just put all those positions back into the first iteration. And what they wanted was they wanted to pick up the best of the IMGs rather than waiting till they got picked up somewhere else in the first iteration, and then they were only looking at other people in the second. So they've been playing around with that, and it's been quite successful, and they're quite attached to it. Do you have a return of service if it's a position that got dumped in there? Possibly. But it's so complicated that I honestly don't know, and I'm supposed to know. In the second iteration, you can only apply if you didn't participate in the first. Now, what is that about? Really? I think it might be if you didn't participate in the first in that program. So let's say you applied to anesthesia, but if they didn't have a position in anesthesia, I don't know how you would have for the IMG stream. But I think that that's what they mean. So if they've looked at you once, they don't want to look at you again, is what they're really saying. So, but if the position is not in one of the disciplines that you were allowed to apply in, then you can apply in the second iteration. And that takes us to Alberta and our Alberta student. Yeah, Alberta's in deep transition, deep depression. Yeah. So they have an IMG program, which that means they assess you in advance. That means that we get a list of the names that they will allow to apply into their program. Which, unlike Quebec, they are also very interested in Canadians studying abroad. And it used to be that they really shut you out. You really could not have got into the province in the year you graduated because they had so many pieces in there that you couldn't accomplish. But they began to realize that what it really meant was they didn't get to look at any of you. And that wasn't comfortable either. So they decided, okay, we're going to change that, and we're going to make the process easy for Canadians studying abroad. So you can go through the AIMG assessment in advance and match in the year you graduate. And they also do it differently. There is no return of service, and it's open. It's not open because they have positions that they designate for IMGs, but they're in a lot of disciplines. So it's a little bit more like Ontario in terms of where they're putting their positions. And then finally we're in BC. How many again were in BC? Yeah, quite a lot of you. BC's a bit uncomfortable right now. Yeah, because we've got some Canadian Studying Abroad Association suing everyone. So it's not necessarily a very friendly place for Canadians studying abroad. It hasn't been great anyway, let's be fair. It's been a difficult process because they had an IMG assessment that they were really married to, and they had some excellent success. And they had been running that program. It was actually one of the best programs in Canada, I think. They'd been running that program for a number of years, but it was not possible for Canadians studying abroad to get into it. So there's some agitation happening by parents, and didn't create good feelings, but they did let go of those assessments that were preventing you from applying. And there is an assessment, which is 6 or 8 weeks or something, but you don't have to do it. It's not mandatory. So some Canadians studying abroad have been able to match in the first iteration in BC, but it's pretty recent. And they have, I think this year, at least 45 positions. So they're increasing the positions every year. I think they will reach a ceiling of about 56 positions specifically for international medical graduates, which is great. That's a very generous allotment. It has a return of service component. If there are vacancies, and vacancies go into the second iteration, they still stay, you can still see it as a label of an IMG position, but anyone can apply for it. So a Canadian graduating student could apply for that position. But if they get it, they have to do that return of service. If a Canadian position goes unmatched in the first iteration and goes through to the second, and an IMG gets it, they don't have to do their return of service. So they have the whole range in every program. I mean, I don't know how they're ever going to sort that out. So they can have IMGs who got into medicine with a return of service, and IMGs who got into medicine without one, and they have Canadians that don't have one, and Canadians that do. So they've just totally messed it up, and I think they're having some difficulties with it. So that's the Canadian condition. We all talk federally and act locally, and every province, you need the book, you need to look at what they're doing, and you need to stay on top of it, because they all approach it a little bit differently. You have a question?
Question with regards to Alberta, because they've often, just in their old system, have AIMG, limited it to people who are from Alberta. Originally, they had roots in there and either had done their undergraduate or their high school diploma in Alberta. Do you know offhand?
They still have a residency component, but they've relaxed it. So you don't necessarily have to prove having done a part of your education there, but you do have to prove some roots in Alberta. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
Can you show that you have roots in multiple provinces? Would that be all right? If you moved around a bit?
Depends if the provinces start talking to each other. Yeah, officially you can. I mean, yeah. Some may want a little longer roots than others.
Well, okay, so
Yeah.
in my case, I
But nobody's going to tell on you.
Oh, okay, that's
Yeah,
fine.
they don't see, you know, because you can individualize your application, and that is one of the strengths of it. They'll never see the letter you write for another program, and you can say, this is the #1 program I've been aiming at all my life, and you could say the same thing to another program. I'm not sure why they would believe you, but you could do that. So you can individualize all of that. So you can certainly discuss your relationship in a province and why you think that you've got roots that would make you a good candidate. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the second iteration, like the timing of it? Is it after the March 4th match? Is there an email that gets released and you have to apply to the second iteration from then on? And when is the second iteration?
You designed it perfectly. That's exactly what I do.
Okay.
Yeah, it's exactly what you would imagine it should be. Okay, so you go in the first, you get your results on March 4th, and as soon as you get your results, if you're unmatched, your name and your file is automatically put into the second iteration. You get a list of what programs are available, and you can start changing your application if you need to, add a few more reference letters if you want to, get somebody to write something different about you, and go forward into the second. The first iteration is about 9 months, the second iteration is 1 month. We get it over with as fast as we can. Okay? But it has the same components. You have an application period, a review period, an interview period, and then you rank your programs. Yeah. We just speed it up. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of access at the moment, unless you have any more questions around access. No? Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, your relationship with the Medical Council of Canada is a lifelong relationship if you're going to reach your goals of being back in the Canadian system. So our domestic graduates, when they enter medical school, they're issued a number called the MINC number. Any of you know what that is? Heard of it? Yeah, some of you have. So that's a medical information number that actually goes with you until you die. Right? You obviously don't have one. But as soon as you register as an international medical graduate with the Medical Council of Canada, you will be issued this number. And it's consistent then throughout your careers. That's the first part of your relationship. The second is, of course, the Medical Council of Canada is charged with evaluating anyone who is not trained in the Canadian system, Canadian North American system. They also actually evaluate Canadians as well, but they have a separate stream for evaluating international medical graduates. The evaluating exam has been in place for many decades. It was there when I started, and that was back in the 80s. So it's been around since about 1970. And it evaluates your undergraduate medical knowledge, simply, and it's a written test. Most of the provinces felt that that really wasn't sufficient as a way of determining whether an internationally trained physician was really able to enter practice, or for that matter, was really able to enter postgraduate training. First of all, it doesn't evaluate your clinical skills at all. So the provinces were playing around with doing their own examinations, and finally they got together and decided that they would leave it as a national exam and they would give it to the Medical Council to do, and that's how the birth of the OSCE from the Medical Council of Canada. So we're going to talk about both those exams, and we're also going to talk about some timing issues, because that's very important for you graduating here in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's quite different than anyone else. So, any of you been on the Medical Council website yet? Good, okay. Get on it, become really intimate with it, because it's one of the most important portals for you to enter back into the Canadian system. No matter when you enter, you have to go through this system. So, as an international medical graduate, if you want to go into postgraduate training, you're able to apply or register with the Medical Council of Canada not earlier than, but within 20 months of your graduation date. They will contact the school to validate you as a person studying in that school, and they'll actually go back and contact the school again at a later date to say, are they still on track to graduate? And then eventually they'll come back and say, did they graduate? So that is the organization that validates and credentials you as a person in the Canadian system, and they do it for everyone all over the world. You have to become a candidate, you have to go online, it's all very centralized, it's very easy to do. You go on and you register, of course you pay lots of money and you get on with it. It's called physiciansapply.ca. Now that's where you go in, that's the portal that you're going to go into as a Canadian, as a student, but it's the same portal that our physicians go into when they renew their licenses all across Canada. So eventually, the Medical Council of Canada will have your portfolio for your career in medicine in the system. And eventually they'll even be collecting any kind of upgrades that you do as you maintain your license throughout your careers. So this is an organization that is going to walk the rest of your career with you. And that's why you need to get as familiar as you can early on. I'm not going to go into too much of this. This is their slides that they provided me. As I told you earlier in the talk, you really need to go to the source. I understand the Medical Council of Canada system. I can understand and answer some of your questions. But by its very definition, my information is more shallow than you may need. So you need to really go to the source for anything too specific. So there's an examination section, which is where you register, and they also have the dates for the upcoming exams. That's a really important piece of information, especially, now you won't go too far into the future, so you might get a bit frustrated, say, I need to know what's happening in 2018, and they're not going to tell you what's going to happen in 2018. But you can see by the consistency of the dates that they do have over a few years, that they do run their exams at the same time every year. So you'll be able to figure it out, even if you don't have the actual dates for the year in which you might be concerned. So this is some of what you will find on that section, and you can just ignore this word right here, because none of you are going to get an exemption from Medical Council of Canada exams. I'm not really sure who does, but I know it isn't any of you. So application and eligibility, you are eligible, provided you're going to graduate. So looking a little bit more at the exams themselves, I can tell you that we did a study, the Medical Council and CaRMS did a study on exam results from different countries, and Australia scored very, very high in exam results at the Medical Council. We have not yet done a study or even had a chance to look at how well the different schools or countries do on the OSCE, because it's too new, but we'll be able to do that as well, but I don't see any reason why it would be different. The evaluating exam is testing you, but it's based on a process or a system in Canada called CaRMS roles. Put your hand up if you know what that refers to. No? Okay. This is something you also, if Canada is your goal, it's also something you need to become familiar with. So the CaRMS roles are now integrated into every aspect of the medical education system. You will get your objectives in any given program under the CaRMS roles. You'll be evaluated under the CaRMS roles, and the medical council evaluates you under the CaRMS roles. So it's the basis of our entire education system, and it's working its way into the undergraduate as well. And it's simply these roles. Obviously the medical expert, clearly the communicator, collaborator, the professional, the manager, the scholar, and the advocate. So all of the questions will be looking at and teasing out your proficiency in any of these roles. But it isn't just limited to this. It's in any specialty you go into. Throughout your career, that's what they're doing. You have a question?
Yes, can I just ask what the CaRMS rules, when did that come out?
Oh, that's been around. It came out of a very big study out of McMaster University back in the 80s, and it evolved into the CaRMS rules. And I can tell you that it's actually been adopted all over the world. They give it slightly different labels, but it has really transformed the way most of the Western world had looked at postgraduate education and how it prepares for physicians. So Canada was very much the leader in this. I mean, the US adopted it afterwards, and they just gave it a different label, and they played with each of those words, but they come out looking exactly the same. So it definitely, Canada has had a very lead role in this. Okay, so test committees organized by health groups, and they're looking at your management functions, data gathering functions, data integration, synthesis. Focuses on your medical knowledge comparable to a minimum expected of a Canadian medical graduate at the time of graduation. So having to take that a little bit earlier obviously puts you at a slight disadvantage, possibly, but since your last 2 years are mostly clinical, I would suggest that all of the knowledge that you acquire in the first 2 years is really most of what's being examined by this exam. You have a slight advantage over anyone in the Northern Hemisphere because you're already 6 months ahead of everybody else. So when you do sit this exam, you're at least 6 months more mature in your programs than anyone else is. It does try to avoid Canadian-specific material because this exam actually is administered all over the world. It was originally designed for immigrant physicians who were considering immigration to Canada to go on and test their knowledge. And if they failed that exam, we hope that it would help them to realize that they were unlikely to be able to practice medicine if they did immigrate to Canada. That was kind of the birth of that exam, but it has since been used as a baseline. So you must pass this exam pretty well for any access to the Canadian system. So this is really the first, and unless they do away with it, which they are talking about, but that won't probably be in the next few years, and just allow the QE1 to replace it. But until they do that, this is the access to the Canadian system. Whether you are planning to stay in Australia and eventually go home, or to do a pathway in the US and eventually go home, almost every one of you put your hand up that you would someday like to practice in Canada. If that's the case, no matter what your planning does, you should take this exam as close to graduation as you can and get it out of the way. Because that's what it's measuring. It's measuring knowledge that you acquired in medical school, and you will forget that stuff. So if Canada is anywhere in your future, you need to get this exam out of the way. So it's 180 questions, of which 150 count. They actually have a sample exam that you can take on the web, and they give you feedback on it, where you're strong, where you perhaps are not so strong. And, I mean, it costs, but it's not a big deal. I said never having to pay for it myself. Okay, so we won't go through that. So this is just an example of one of the questions that comes up on there. No point in memorizing it because it won't come up on yours. So the idea is a key feature approach. always a clinical scenario with critical information, takes the candidate to a decision point, and you choose the best response. And clearly you should read the question. So I'm sure all of you got this, but the last button was the answer. Okay? The medical, that exam has been around for a long time. There's a lot of history here in the school with it, so this is not going to be a problem for you. So the next exam, if you pass the EE, then you are able to register to take the NACOSCI. Whenever you decide to do this, I have to tell you that there's a lot of pressure on that registration point, just because this exam is administered in 7 different centers. You get to choose which is the most convenient for you to take, where in Canada you would take the exam, and that puts a lot of pressure on the administration of organizing this exam. What that means for you is, as soon as you know you want to take it, as soon as registration opens, get on there. Don't say, I've got 2 months to register, I've got, you know, this many weeks. Get your name in and register immediately, because getting people placed in centers across Canada is a huge task, and you want to be on that first list so that you might have some choice of where you're going to be when you sit this exam. It is a collaboration, so it's actually replaced all the different local exams that once were out there, in which case if you took the exam in Nova Scotia and you went to apply in Ontario, they wouldn't use your exam results. It was outrageous, really. So now we have a single exam administered in 7 different centers, but it's good everywhere in Canada. Both the EE and the NACOSCI do not have an expiry date. Okay, so you can take them and then make other plans, and they're still good if you're entering the postgraduate system. This exam is only if you intend to enter the Canadian postgraduate system. You don't need this exam if you're doing another pathway and intend to come back to practice. This is not the exam you would be administering. This is only if you're entering the postgraduate system. Whereas the EE, at this point, is for any access into the Canadian system. Most of this we've covered. It's a prerequisite. It is now mandatory across Canada. So the format is OSCEs. You take OSCEs here. It's probably not any different than your experience will be here in Sydney. 12 stations. We only use physician examiners. We don't use trained examiners. There's always physicians. It happens to be faculty from across the country. A standard station would be 11 minutes, 8 minutes patient encounter, da-da-da-da-da-da. There is some therapeutic knowledge. In other words, there is Canadian contact for certain in this exam. What is being assessed is your clinical skills, knowledge, behaviors at a level of a recent medical graduate in the Canadian system. Includes but is not limited to medicine, peds, OBGYN, psychiatry, surgery. Some of the challenges for immigrants would not be a challenge for most of you around language, culture, communications. Professionalism and respect, appropriate consent are all ethical and professional issues which do definitely come up. So let's have a look at one. Again, an OSCE station that they have provided for you to have a look at, so you just get a little tiny bit of a sense of how this might feel to go through one of these. Okay. So what they're going to be, from that question, what your physician examiner is looking at is in this thing. So each station has its own evaluation system because they're evaluating different things. In this one, they're evaluating that you've elicited the presenting problems, history of the presenting problems. So you have to have covered in your conversation with what happens to be the wife in this case, all of these pieces. Specifically ask the following symptoms. You have to have touched in your conversation on all of those issues. Elicits a past medical history, elicits information about lifestyle, and informs the patient about what's about to happen. So one of the things they're looking at is how organized are you? So you will get a scenario before you go in, and you get time to think about your organization of this patient encounter, right? And that's a really important part of it. You have to be ready to do things in an appropriate and professional order. You have to be able to work with your patient so that they don't get uneasy with you because you're going all over the place. You have to be respectful, little things like you don't call them by their first name if you expect them to, you know, I mean, there's lots of little things in there that they're looking for. That is what they're looking for. Of course they're looking for your medical knowledge and how you handle it, but they're also looking specifically at your clinical skills. So the rating is, you know, looking at the bottom one, rapport with a person. On the negative side, condescending, offensive, judgmental, that wouldn't go over well. Minimal courtesies only, borderline satisfactory, polite, interested, warm, empathetic. Okay, so that's the range of how they're looking at you in your physician role. And the other things are similar. Logical flow, sense of purpose in your questions. Okay, so that gives you just a sense of what that OSCE station was trying to measure and how you would be evaluated from your encounter with them. As of 2016, all of the provinces have decided that this is mandatory and that you cannot enter the postgraduate system without it. So that means this is not a CaRMS criteria, this is a program criteria. In fact, this year, one province did not require it, so many Canadians studying abroad didn't take it, even though there's really only one province in that. Is that water? Only one province, and that was Saskatchewan. So the 200 or so who didn't take it were all applying to Saskatchewan because that was the last standing place that you could go. Anyway, Saskatchewan has decided that they do need this exam, and as of next year, it's mandatory everywhere. So the things that you will find in the CaRMS website, and all of you have been on it, so you probably have explored this, but we try to gather information about every aspect of the criteria, what is going to be measured in your application, what kind of weight programs put on it. But they're not always that generous in giving that information. But we're working on a research project now to get more transparency from the programs in how they evaluate you, so that you have an idea, what is the point of applying here if they say they only are looking at people, or the only people who are successful in this program have done a major research project. And I was just a minor player in my research, or I only did, you know, some basics. So then you would know, this program's really not going to take me seriously. They haven't been as transparent as they could be. And we're really working towards that because this is a huge process and you need as much help as you can get in strategizing. We won't do too much on that because it's not necessary. So we organize our match time-wise to make it possible to apply to the US and Canada at the same time, to pursue both strategies all the way to the end. So you end up, you can submit a rank order list in Canada and a rank order list in the US. But time-wise, we always run our match first. So that means that you have deliberately ranked your Canadian programs in preference to any program on your American list. Because inevitably, if I run the match first, that's what you've done. So in a strategy, if you have one or two options in Canada that you would really prefer, but if you don't get them, you would rather go into the US, where we know there are more opportunities, your rank order list should reflect that. There should only be 2 ranks on your rank order list, because those are the 2 programs that you would prefer to anything else. Then if you're not matched, your list in the US will stand. But if you are matched, your list disappears in the US. You're taken out of the match, and CaRMS does that, so you don't have any, there's nothing that you have to do about that. We get the lists and we remove your names out of the US system. So in effect, you can do the both matches by having CaRMS first, the US second. If you're not matched in the US either, you'll get your notifications on the Monday, and you'll have until Thursday or Friday to scramble to vacancies. If you're not matched there, then you go back into the second iteration in CaRMS. So you actually have 4 chances to match in the North American system, and we line that up very deliberately to give you the widest possible options. Okay? Now, people often ask me, if I do the step 1 and 2, is that okay? Is that going to be okay for Canada? No. You have to do the Canadian exams for Canada. It was just like saying, well, why don't they accept the Medical Council of Canada exam in the US? Well, why would they? They're the US, they've got their exams. So you have to do the examinations that are relevant to those 2 countries, totally separate. Now, the timing isn't that bad, but they are totally separate. What they are doing is those exams are actually quite similar. They're measuring very similar things, so if you're studying for one, you're studying for both, inevitably. But I can't give you specifics of timing because your curriculums are different than the Northern Hemisphere, which I do know the lineup, and you have different options. Having chosen Australia, you actually have an option to possibly do an internship in Australia. I can tell you, no other country offers Canadians studying abroad a postgraduate opportunity. This is the only country that has that as one of your options. So it does allow you to strategize slightly differently. It's complicated. However, you do find out about your internship long before you have to put a rank order list into the CaRMS batch. So you can still pursue all of those processes, but if you get an internship, you cannot submit a rank order list to CaRMS. Now, I can't mandate that because I don't have access to that information, but I can tell you that those Canadians who've gone before you, who have gone ahead and submitted a list and then got matched in CaRMS, and then walked away from their internships in July, is some of the very reasons that you are having trouble and feeling anxious about your internships here in Australia. It has not done you any favor in the Australian system. So I would suggest to you that 1, it's not professional, and 2, staying and doing the internship that you agreed to only strengthens your hand in terms of your application back into the Canadian system the following year. Even if you've already applied in Canada and gone through the whole thing except you haven't submitted a rank order list because you accepted your internship, no one knows that. The next year you come in, those documents can be forwarded, you start again. It doesn't in any way hurt you. In fact, when I look at the data out of Australia, I would say more than half, possibly 3/4 of the Australian graduates who are Canadians have done an internship in Australia. And it may be one of the reasons that their match result is so much higher than anywhere else in the world.
Sandra, we've got a question here about timing from one of the students elsewhere.
Yes?
For Quebec, would I be able to write the MCCE before actually graduating here in Sydney and have the results in time for the match? The answer is you have to do it early, don't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did say that,
Yeah.
you know, you can register with the MCC 20 months before you're going to graduate.
Yeah.
And once you're registered, you can sit whatever exam you feel you're ready to sit. No one's going to say, you know, can't do it now.
And there's several
And there are
systems,
many
aren't there?
issues of that exam. I think that the EE is run in September, November, January. Maybe you know even better what the next May, March, anyway, many sessions. And of course it's here in Australia, so it's very easy to do that. What you need to do is choose your time that is best for your preparation, for your curriculum here, and to allow you to take the NAC-OSCE at an appropriate time.
So is there a different exam for Quebec?
No.
No. There
But
is
Quebec
no-
asks for an additional exam, and I think that the question is not,
The QE, the MCC QE.
they ask for the QE.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you, I believe, have to be closer to graduation
Right.
in order to be eligible to write the QE one. And you also have to have already passed the EE, because the EE is a first step. You can't, as an international medical graduate, access anything else until you have the EE out of the way. So once you've passed your EE, then you can start doing other things, and one of those things is the QE one.
QE.
So the alignment of time in Quebec, because they require the QE1, and I think there's now the only province that still does, is a little bit complicated. Still easier if you're graduating in Australia than anywhere else. It's still possible.
You mentioned the QE one. Is it in that it's mandatory for now in Quebec? What about the other provinces? Do we have to write the double E and the E1?
No, that's why I didn't mention it, because it's not. It's only in Quebec.
Only in Quebec, thank you.
Yeah, for entry into postgraduate training.
Yes.
Yeah, so the only exams in the rest of Canada that are required are the EE and the NACOSCI. But Quebec, as you know, does everything differently. Yes?
You didn't mention, so if you wanted to do the NACOSCI in September, or in March of 4th year, you need to do the EE by September in 3rd year.
September or November?
The last date is September, it says on the MCC
Okay,
website.
so that would be the lineup for their registration for the NACOSCI.
For in March. So
Yeah.
if you want to do it in September of 4th year, you needed to have the E done in March of 4th year. Just
Oh, no, that's the other way. So you're reversing it. If you want to do the March NACOSCI,
in 4th year, the EE has to be done in September of 3rd year.
and if you want to do the March EE, you do that for the September OSCE.
Yeah.
I mean, that timeline may shorten. To be perfectly honest, it's because the Medical Council has just made this a national exam, and managing the administration of that is huge. So you may find that you eventually, when you take it, you could actually take a later version of the EE and still get registered. But at this point, they're looking for a fairly broad timeline to separate those two exams. Because the results come out in about 6 weeks, sometimes even less time. So it's not that they don't know you've passed, it's just trying to administer this exam in 7 centers and get people where they want to take the exam is a nightmare at the moment. So that may shorten, but at this point, as far as you know, you need almost a 6-month window. But thank you for that. Yes?
You said that the earliest you can write the EE was 20 months before you graduate,
Yes.
so that's the earliest date.
Yes.
So that means that you couldn't write it, you'd have to write it somewhere in 3rd year at the earliest. But you can't write it just after 2nd year?
Not if that's more than 20 months.
No, it has maximum is 20 months.
So say if I wanted to take my Step 1 US exam, like just before 3rd year starts, I'd have to wait another 4 months before I can write the EE.
Whatever makes 20 months.
And you'd have to travel back home to wait this, right?
No. No.
The EE is available all over the world.
Okay, gotcha, thanks.
Yeah, that's the one you can actually take here in Australia.
I've got another question here,
Mhm.
Sandra from Clement. Are there statistics for the percentage of Canadians studying abroad IMGs who have matched in 2014 or for any other years?
That's my next section.
Well timed.
Imagine that. So first of all, these are some of the sources that you can go to for tools for CaRMS. We put a lot of effort into trying to update this and keep it very accurate for you. This whole Twitter, Facebook thing, you can be guaranteed I didn't start this. But my staff told me this is where we have to go because this is what they're doing. So luckily somebody in there, my office, knows exactly what they're doing, and so they've got all of this out there on social media, and we take a lot of pride in keeping it very up to date. So you can feel quite comfortable in following. Be our friend. Is that what I'm supposed to say? Come and be. I don't know. Anyway, you don't have to be registered with CaRMS to come and talk to us or send us your notes. We're quite happy to answer your questions. All right, let's get into some data. Now, this isn't the happiest part of my presentation. You have to be ready for that, okay? Because the reality is that there's a lot of people out there who have chosen to do exactly what you've done, and they've put a lot of pressure on the system. And you're going to see that coming out in the data. All right? So first of all, I looked a little bit at some electives, but I have to admit that this data is not recent data. But I was looking at how much impact doing the elective in the same province was. And I have to tell you that since Ontario has 6 schools and the biggest population, I'm not sure that that doesn't totally distort even a little optimism it seemed to give in doing it in a province. I really honestly do not believe it matters a hoot whether you do it in the province that you want to be in. Because if you can get one, just take it. What's that expression? If there's a fork in the road, take it. If you can get an elective, no matter how, no matter where, no matter doing what, by all means, take the opportunity. Don't worry, oh gosh, it's not in the province I'm going to be in, I think I should say no. Never say no. Just go for it. We have the same issues at home. Students feel that they have to go out and do an elective in the program that they most want to be in. But my data shows every year that that's actually a negative thing to do, because they all say they did an elective in the program that they wanted to get into, and then I asked them if they got into it, and the majority did not. So that tells me that people can know you too well, too early on. A little mystery goes a long way. You don't have to do an elective in the program that you're interested in. Chances are you can't, but it's not even necessary. Same discipline, again, it's hard to do that. So in this one, I was looking at just what's been happening over the last decade. And so the blue line is our own graduating class. And you can see that over the last decade, we've increased the number by 80%. The gray line is the introduction of the immigrant physicians back into the first iteration. Remember I told you in 2006, they decided to fund it. So I think in the very beginning, nobody believed it. And then the next year, everybody who didn't go in the year before jumped in, and then it leveled out a bit. So the dip that you see in 2015 is specifically to do with the introduction of the NACOS scheme. And I think just like 2006 and 7, you're going to see it come back up to a fairly stable number. Because immigration is a pretty stable concept in our system. We immigrate, we bring in 250,000 immigrants every year. We only want professionals. So the number of people who are trying to access our system is pretty constant from year to year to year. The only thing that we have not counted in is that bright orange line, and that's you. And you can see that in 2006, there was probably way less than 100 of you, and by 2015, there are more than 1,000 of you accessing the match. Over that same period, I've tracked the funding for postgraduate training in Canada. Now, this is only funding that is available to, it's not our visas. We do have some Saudi visas come into the system, but they come in with their own funding and then they leave again. But this is Ministry of Health funding for our postgraduate system. So we've divided the bars up to Royal College and Family Medicine, because that's a very consistent proportioning, and it's proportioned by our provinces. They're very, this is one of the things that they hold on to very carefully. In fact, they're increasing the proportion of family medicine over other specialties. And Quebec has now moved to 55 family medicine, 45% other specialties. BC has a commitment to move to 50-50. But they include in that some medicine positions and some peds positions as generalist type training. And all the other provinces just do family medicine, Royal College. So we've maintained that proportion, and it's worked very well for the Canadian system. And then the green line is our graduating class size. So you can see that starting in 2006, the funding has been in place for the international medical graduate component in our system, and it's been maintained. The other thing you can see very clearly is that the governments all across the country have maintained the increases as the graduating class size has increased, which has actually been an amazing commitment. So for every graduating class that's come out that's a little bit higher, they add a little bit more in every province. What is not obvious here is we've now leveled out. 2015 was the last graduating class size that was going to be larger than the class before. So there are no more increases in our graduating class size, and as a result, there will not be any more increases in our postgraduate system. These are the actual numbers. I am only looking at international medical graduates here. So in the 2014 match, we had just under 2,900 who submitted an application. That's what I say by active. They came into the system and they prepared an application and they sent it somewhere. Generally, a significant proportion of those do not submit a rank order list. You can see it's down about 500, more than 500, and the year before the same. There's a number of factors at play here. One is that the US system was having early offers. They've stopped that now, so that may have an impact this year on how many people withdraw from the match and just don't submit a rank order list. You also see here a factor that I kind of call the confidence factor, and that is international medical graduates who didn't get any interviews say, well, what's the point of submitting a rank order list? There was just no interest in my application, so I'm just not going to bother. You also have the Australian factor here, people who have applied everywhere and then decided to take an internship in Australia. So there's a number of things at play. And then the last column, as you can see, the actual number of international medical graduates who are matched totally in the system each of those years. This is a new study that I was looking at. I prepared this for the executive board of the Medical Council, and then when I saw it, I realized that it had some very powerful messages, and so I brought it along to my trip here this year. So what I did was I looked at the average scores of those who were successfully matched, and I divided them up into different categories. A Canadian studying abroad who's never been in a match before, first iteration and second iteration. So you're the purple line that takes that dramatic go off into the stratosphere. The immigrants are the orange line. This is first iteration. So you can see that the average score for the immigrants has been pretty stable. And back in 2008, the average score was quite a lot higher than the average score of the Canadian studying abroad who was actually successful in the match. So people were favoring you. There weren't as many of you, but they were favoring you, even though the quantitative data was not as impressive as the immigrant physicians who were matched. They were making, standards were a little difficult. Second iteration, all the way along, people generally have a slightly lower score. What this amazing trajectory of the Canadian studying abroad average scores in the EE exam. Now this is only the EE exam because we haven't had enough examples of people taking the NAC-OSCE yet. We just don't have enough data to look at it. So this is just the EE. This enormous increase, I started to look at it and I thought, oh, have all the schools got, you know, setting out more time or changing their curriculum so that it matches the Canadian system better? And I don't think it's any of that. I think what you see absolutely is how competitive it is now to get into the system. So Canadians studying abroad could get into the system with a 300 in 2008, and they now are scoring much higher. Those who are matched have much higher scores. So it is simply, I think, a product of the numbers and the competition that you're dealing with. A little bit like getting into medical school, right? That's the reality. The other way I wanted to look at this data was how many people had come into the match more than once. So this is just looking at Canadians studying abroad. In 2008, the soft blue line there is so small. And the only reason that you would come back into the match is that you weren't successful the first year you went through. Right? And so you can see that that has dramatically increased because the numbers have dramatically increased. Yes?
In the previous slide you showed, do you have any data looking at US at least at one of those?
I don't have any scores. Well, I have scores, but they're scores that you input, whereas my medical council scores are scores that the medical council inputs. So I wouldn't do research on a data entry that way. Okay. It would be interesting, but because I don't get a direct source, it's not useful. Yeah. So there are many challenges ahead of you, and I think what this slide, I'm not trying to discourage you or make you feel badly, but what I'm trying to show you is that you need to have more than one pathway, and you need to pursue all of the pathways that are available to you consecutively so that you have the best possible chance of getting postgraduate training somewhere. And as I said, because Australia has a capacity and has agreed to allow the internationally trained physicians here from Australia into their postgraduate system, you have an advantage that no one else has, that I see in the system. So that's incredible. And there are also other advantages. If you stay in Australia and do your training here, there's a great deal of reciprocity in both Royal College surgeons, Royal College medicine training, and our system. Family medicine training is actually directly related. If you do your exams in Australia, you don't need to do them in Canada. That's how much they accept that. The same is actually true for some training in the US. So if you're in family medicine in the US and you are certified, I think it's called board certified in the US, you don't have to write the exam in Canada. It's accepted. And you are able to get certification based on your US training, exactly the same as in Australia. The other specialties, everyone is a little bit different, but there is some recognition of training. So if you take the US route, there you begin your negotiations with the Royal College right from the beginning. Contact them, tell them what you're going to be doing, ask them to clarify what you need, where you would, keep up a relationship with them if at some point you intend to bring that training back into the Canadian system. So those are just some examples of the pathways, things that you'll be thinking about. In reality, you have had amazing success in the system, and you have matched more successfully as a group than our immigrant physicians, and you've taken the lion's share of the positions each year. You'll never take all of the positions because I think that would have a huge impact on the Canadian system. We have to have opportunities for our immigrant physicians to practice medicine as well. There are other opportunities, but that's one of the major ones. So you'll never take all 450, but generally you have been matched to at least 60% each year. So it's not that there aren't opportunities in Canada, there absolutely are, but there's just so many of you, we can't accommodate all of you. So you need to have other options open to you. We talked a little bit about training in the US. Just one warning that you need to be sure that your training is ACGME accredited, because that's the only training that's recognized in the Canadian system. You do have different exams. I can't bring you information about the timing of those exams just because it's not my expertise. You need to stay in a relationship with the Royal College because they will assess your training and make sure that you can lead to practice. But the final thing is that the Medical Council, as I told you earlier, runs two sets of exams, one for the international medical graduate trying to enter our system, but also they run all the exams for our own Canadian graduates. So the QE1 is an exam that our graduates take about a month before they graduate. Okay, so again, it's measuring their knowledge. It's almost the same as the EE. In fact, the EE is based on it, right? So if you're successful in the EE, you won't find a big leap to the QE1 exam, except it has Canadian content, inevitably. After 8 months of postgraduate training, Canadians are then able to sit the OSCE, which is called the QE2. Once they have successfully completed the QE1 and the QE2, they have the Licentiate of the Medical Council of Canada. That's the title, that's the designation. A full license in Canada anywhere is two things: Licentiate of the Medical Council of Canada and certification in one of our two colleges. The combination of that gives you a full license to practice anywhere in Canada. So no matter what pathway you choose, if, as you said, coming back to Canada to practice is in your future, then you need to stage your taking of these two exams, the QE1 and the QE2, when you're most likely to pass them. So if you get into a training program, into residency, I'm sorry, I don't know the language very well in the Australian system, but if it's specialty specific, it is not wise to wait till you complete it before you try to take these exams, because the reality is they're measuring very broad-based training. They're not measuring, in fact, we've already seen in our Canadian system, if a program is too specialty specific right from the beginning, those candidates don't do very well in the QE2. So you need to take this exam when your training is the broadest it has been. And in Australia, of course, your internship provides that. So after your internship is when you're best prepared and ready to take the QE2. Once you have that, you've just opened one more door for the eventual return to Canada. Okay, that's the sum total. Yes?
So I've got another question
All right.
online here
Mm-hmm.
from Clement. If we only apply for internship in Australia and do not manage to get an Australian internship, then decide to apply through CaRMS in the following year, will the 1 year of unemployment be detrimental in any way to our CaRMS application?
Well, unfortunately, those questions are not easily answered. I'm not a program director. There are approximately 5,000 people who are part of the selection process at postgraduate training in Canada. That's 5,000 individuals looking at files and making their own assumptions. They're all physicians. Some might think, you know what, they're a year out and this candidate isn't, and they didn't do anything during that year, so maybe that makes them not so strong. Somebody else who knows the Australian system might have a different attitude. It's definitely high risk if you're not doing anything for a year. There's no way to paint that any differently. Yes?
I have another question about the QE1. I know you said it's not mandatory other than in Quebec to have that exam. Can you write it, pass, and not disclose it to programs? Or does it automatically get, your score, does it automatically get included in the
No,
application?
one of the drop-down boxes you have to admit that you wrote it. Okay, if you wrote it, because we ask you, did you take this exam? So you have to say, yes, you took the exam. And then one of the options you have, I do not choose to disclose this, Mark. Is that a good strategy? I would suggest it's not a great strategy. Because chances are they will automatically make an assumption, right, that isn't necessarily to your benefit. So if you pass the exam, you might not want to have that drop down. Okay, thank you very much. That's the total of my presentation. I'm happy to take any other questions that you might have. We're here for a few more minutes, but not that much longer, but I know that sometimes people come up and have a private question they want to ask. Happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Everybody, I have an announcement not at all related to CaRMS, but very much related to Canada, or being paid. The office that works on international outreach for North American students has asked me to try to coordinate like a Canada Student Bonding Day. So on April 12th, which is the last day of our week off, which is April 11th at home, there's back-to-back Canadian NHL team games. And so they're thinking at Manning of projecting the games throughout the day and having like a drop-in, drop-out hockey day. Possibly with poutine and Caesars because I made that request. So I'll probably post in the NAMSA Facebook group about it. So, but just so you know,
About the what? Okay, I think we're going to put that.
It was just that somebody said, can you elaborate more about the Dean's letter regarding the format? I think that was about...
Well, in fact, you know, we have a standardized format, but nobody uses it. So
Yeah.
I think it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Liz.
Okay.